And so now we're in chapter 10, which is looking at the role of campaigns, elections, and political participation. And in this, we have three separate lectures. The first one is this one that talks about who usually wins elections. We're not naming names, but we can talk about the general trends about who is likely to win an election, because we know there are certain aspects of a campaign and election and about the candidates themselves that make it possibly likely to win and others not to. And we want to talk about those structural factors, not the individual personality aspects of these candidates, but instead, what are some of the structural factors that lead it that we can say ahead of time, even in the 2020 election, we know considerably and why they're going to win. So that's what we're going to cover in this one. The next one we're going to cover is in the second lecture. We're going to talk of money. Money is an important aspect, obviously. It provides the resources to candidates to be able to buy the TV ads that are really the main way in about the candidates. If they decide to do that. We're also going to talk about the fact when we talk about political participation that some people really use shortcuts. As Dr. Haas talked about, political party is perhaps the most importantly used in our society to decide who they're going to vote for or not. But for those who do seek out extra information about the candidates, it's usually through put on television where they find out about the candidates. And we're going to be talking about how that money is raised, as well as talking a little bit about those campaign ads and how those to the ways in which our political system works. The final section we're going to talk about is political participation, with a particular emphasis on voting and why it's so low in the United States. Why is voter turnout so low in the United States, even though, as we talked about very early on in this, the reason Republicans are talking about wanting to protect against voter fraud is because voting is a foundation of our democratic republic. And so why is it that so few people participate? We already know some of the answers, and you know some of the answers. Some is that the information that's necessary to gather to feel that you are on for election or not is hard to collect because the media and interest groups aren't necessarily providing us with the information that we need to be good democratic citizens. So it puts a little bit of the work on us, and some of us are too busy to do that work. We are also going to take a look at some of the other ways in which the electoral system doesn't necessarily provide us with an easy way to answer this question. For example, we saw in political parties that the fact that we have two and only two parties is a barrier to people participating, because it's unlikely that an individual is going to like all of the policies taken by the only two parties that are available. A lot of people will choose about 40% of Americans actually choose to be independent or decline to state a party. And yet, if they only have two choices, Democrat or Republican, they're forced to choose something that they wouldn't necessarily want. If there were perhaps a PR system with more parties that were clearer in terms of what they were promising to do when in office, then people might be able to select a political party that is closer to their position. But we don't have that because the electoral system, a single member district plurality voting system, makes it so that we have only two and only two. And so this is a potentially confusing chapter, but in many ways it's not. It's actually a review and a linkage to the final stuff that we've done. So in this sense, this third exam and this third section of the course is going to take a look at campaigns, election, political participation, Congress, and the presidency are all ones that link together. Storyline, it seems to make sense. So enough of a preview about what we're going to be doing. Let's talk about who usually wins elections. And we can start to see immediately that there is that way in which it links us to some of the stuff we've learned already in this course. And so if you take a look at the slide, there are actually three primary answers to who usually wins elections. And none of them have to do with the personality of the candidates running. What we're asking and looking at are structural factors. And who usually wins elections? First thing is a Democrat or Republican. Third parties don't win in our political system. We saw that in the last chapter in political parties. We have a single member district plurality voting system that leads to two and only two political parties, which then means that the only chance you have of winning, unless you live in a state like Maine or Vermont, those exotic places have independents who win. So Bernie Sanders, who is a senator, U.S. senator from Vermont, is an independent. So they do exist, but that almost proves the rule. The fact that that is so rare and is so unusual, points out the fact that really the only chance that anyone has of winning is a Democrat or Republican. And think about that. Bernie Sanders, who is an independent in the US Senate, is running for the Democratic Party nomination because he recognizes at the presidential level the only way that he had any chance of having his ideas heard or any chance of winning is to try to seek the nomination of one of the political parties. He needs to be a Democrat or Republican. The only way a president is going to be elected is that they are a Democrat or Republican. That is something that we have never had an independent president, and we system is set up because the Electoral College is a whole series of single-member district plurality voting systems. And that is that the candidate with the most votes in the most popular vote in the state gets all of the Electoral College votes for that state. And so in that sense, it's a single-member district plurality voting system. And that leads to two and only two parties that can exist. So who usually wins elections? You either need to be a Democrat or a Republican. The other factor that matters is incumbent, and particularly in Congress, it's a little less clear for the presidency because it's such a small number of presidents that we've had. And so it's harder for us scientifically, if we want to call political science a science, and it's in our name, but not everyone agrees that it is. But if you want to call it a science, then you would want to say, okay, how much can we predict what's going to happen in the future? And so just a few seconds ago, I said that I can predict that there will not be an independent president of the United States. It's going to be a Democrat or Republican. So I can predict that. But in some ways, it's hard to talk about the incumbency effect on the President of the United States. Generally speaking, and people can decide whether or not that is a good thing or not for themselves, the President will get reelected. Generally speaking, presidents have 2 terms, but that doesn't happen. So you have the first President Bush had only 1 term in office. You had other examples where that has occurred. And so that can happen, but most likely, if you take a look at Obama had 2 terms, the younger Bush had 2 terms, Clinton had 2 terms. So we find that presidents get the 2 terms that they're constitutionally allowed to have if they get reelected after 4 years. But at the same time, there are examples where it can be a 1-term president. And again, I can say, for you, you can decide whether or not how that applies to the current president and whether or not that is something you're hoping for, you're afraid of, whatever that might be, you can sort of think about these things. But generally speaking, and for the legislative branch, we can be much clearer about this. If you are already in office, you will get reelected at rates that are absurdly high. And as we're going to be talking about, even though incumbents win and get reelected time and time again, we're very unhappy with that system. And so we already know the problem with this is that it is a challenge to popular idea that we re-elect these individuals at high rates should suggest that we're happy with the situation, but we're not. We're very unhappy with the situation, and yet they get re-elected at rates. So in the House of Representatives, the re-election rate for those seeking re-election in the House of Representatives is at 93%, and for those who are in the U.S. Senate, it's at 88%. That should suggest that we really like the work that they're doing. But we don't. We don't like it individually. We don't like it collectively. It's a problem because they get reelected time and again. And so we have to talk about why that might be. And the final thing that talks about who usually wins election is the candidate who raises the most money and spends the most money usually wins. And again, that's not that surprising. Money is the way in which the politicians can get their ideas out. We talked about this when we talked about freedom of speech and whether or not the actual money spent by a candidate for their own campaign, and this was back in Buckley versus Valeo of 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court argued that individual candidates can spend as much of their own money as they would like. And some argued that that interpretation of the U.S. Constitution is an argument that you can have as much speech as you can afford, because wealthier people have more money, they therefore have access and able to spend as much of their own money on their campaign as they would like. But then there are some restrictions, as we talked about, and we'll talk about again, about how if you give money to a campaign, that's seen as symbolic speech, and that can be limited to some extent. But because money is so important and because those with money find ways of influencing politics, there have been some important loopholes that we're going to talk about. And so in many ways, we're going to have a separate lecture talking about the role of money in terms of how that influences campaigns and elections. So that's the second lecture that we're going to be talking about. So for the rest of this lecture, moving on to the next part, we're going to talk about why it is that Democrats are Republicans, why it is only those who win the seats, and then the power of incumbency.